for relaunching the Illicit Activities Initiative. And last summer on a trip to North Korea, well, it was a trip to South Korea, but it was on the subject of North Korea, Secretary Clinton announced that the administration would take steps to tackle the illicit activity coming out of the North. Is there evidence of the type of coordinated campaign that you led in the past, the type of success that we saw? Is there evidence of that? I haven't seen the evidence of it. Well,
I mean, the ultimate evidence of the Illicit Activities Initiative was evidence. We developed tremendous undercover investigations through the Department of Justice with the State Department's full support, and I sort of acted as a bit of an ambassador opening doors for the Department of Justice law enforcement officers globally into 15 different countries, 5 global investigations. And at the end of the first term of the Bush administration, actually at the beginning of the second term, I should say, it was decided essentially to remove that evidence from the judicial process. We had 2 of the largest Asian organized crime cases in United States history involving the Gambino crime family at one end, Chinese triads at the other, and the North Korean government sort of in the middle. It was quite spectacular stuff. And although there were people arrested in some pretty interesting operations in the United States and elsewhere, the hand of North Korea was never really fully identified. And you think that was for diplomatic reasons? It was for diplomatic reasons, and I seriously objected to it because it wasn't like the North Koreans didn't know they were engaging in counterfeiting the U.S. dollar, cooperation with organized crime groups, including Chinese triads, and work on illicit proliferation, which we approached as a criminal activity as well. And there were, preparations to bring criminal charges against some of the proliferation networks down the road as well. So the question is, whatever happened to all that information? Right. At the very least, I would encourage this administration to consider briefing the American people on what we learned, and perhaps briefing the United States Nations Security Council, probably in the context of re-examining whether they should be put back on the terrorism list. I found the Chonan incident where the South Korean ship was sunk vicious, savage, and absolutely inconsistent with a terrorist-type approach. And I think that would cause North Korea some concern if it were coupled with revelations of some of the law enforcement information or restarting of an active initiative which involved, in our case, 14 different government agencies and departments and 15 government partners around the world. I can't imagine that's going on right now. Now, this takes me to an issue that we've long talked about in this committee, but you note that the Illicit Activities Initiative could have had a much broader impact to affect North Korea's proliferation activities. And as you said, we never were given sufficient latitude to have a deeper and sustained counter-proliferation impact, and on repeated occasions were waved off from taking actions that were well within our mandate and authorities. Well, you've laid out some of this, and I know of a lot of it just from our engagement at the time, and I remember how desperately there was an effort to shut down what you were doing. But what do you think drove that? I think that there was, I've discussed this with several of senior colleagues before, and part of it appears to have been a misperception at the very highest levels in the administration as to what was actually going on. I recall a conversation I had with Secretary Powell at the very end of his time where he said, "What do you mean we're not doing this stuff?" And because I think that sometimes there were discussions, and this is in some of these memoirs which are coming out at the principals level during the Bush administration, where they sort of agreed on something and then it sort of somehow it didn't quite happen. And I did co-chair a coordinating committee at the National Security Council in addition to being at State, and it was directly involved in this issue set. And I did. It was a coordinated campaign that somebody shut down. We were essentially abbreviated, and then we were emasculated. Yeah. And this was a problem because this was right when the North Korean government was building illicitly a Syrian nuclear reactor. All sorts of very strange and extremely disturbing stuff was going on with Iran. We've heard about Burma in the press recently. I mean, and you had them dead to rights. I mean, I was in Macau. I've seen the phony Treasury notes that were counterfeited by the North Koreans, our Treasury notes. Yeah. And these were, and that was really a tool. The fact that they were engaged in illegal activities was laid to put them in their own trap. We felt it was almost essentially self-sanctioning. So all we had to do without using sanctions, which we felt we couldn't get without the evidence coming out on nuclear proliferation, was just to start charging them for their own offenses, knowing that the leadership of North Korea itself was directly engaged in those criminal activities.
Right. Now, let me ask a question, Juan Zarate. You call in your testimony for deploying the 311 sanctions against Iran and its central bank. I talked about that in my opening statement. What is the holdup? And does the fact that Section 311 sanctions were only just deployed after a 5-year hiatus reflect the difficulty of identifying targets, or is it the result of the restrictions that political considerations place on their use?
I think there are three issues, Congressman Royce. I think first there was a tendency to not use 311 after Banco Delta Asia. There was a string of 311 actions that we used against bad banks in my tenure at the Treasury, and I think a tendency was shifted to use other tools, executive orders and other tools of financial suasion, which is fine, but there was less of an emphasis on the development of the use of 311. Second, you have a concern about using a financial tool of this magnitude against a central bank of a country, which has never been done before, and would call into question how the mechanics of that would actually work. And I think there are ways of crafting a 311 regulation that would allow you to get around some of the sensitivities of targeting a central bank while getting at the illicit activity that the Central Bank of Iran is actually facilitating. Finally, I think there's a deeper policy question at play, which is how far are we willing to go to actually strangle the Iranian economy? Part of the challenge here has been a message and a policy decision that the efforts that we would undertake publicly and diplomatically would be targeted at the regime itself. And
yeah, but you know, we targeted Iraq's central bank under Saddam Hussein. So
that's right. But again, this goes to the deep fundamental policy question. Will this be a maximalist pressure campaign that ultimately impacts the people in Iran, or will we constrain ourselves to the effect that we really don't want to demonstrate that we're going after the whole of Iranian society? And so I think that's at play as well in the context of the debate about 311.
Yeah. Well, listen, Mr. Zarate, I want to thank you and Mr. Asher, Mr. Kittrey, for all of those who have been architects of a policy here that had great promise, great likelihood of success if fully deployed, in my opinion. I hope you'll continue work in this direction, because I think it is the least confrontational way in order to engage and prevent the types of proliferation activities that we've seen, for example, in North Korea. If they can't get the hard currency, we know from talking to defectors who worked in their military and in their civilian government, if they can't get the hard currency, it is very difficult for them to buy the gyroscopes on the black market that they need for their missile systems. It's very difficult for them to pay for the type of hardware that they need to go forward. And so I just want to thank you. We appreciate the time and expertise you've brought to this. And when considering states like Iran and North Korea, the stakes for us, frankly, do not get any higher. So we appreciate your insights on how to tackle the challenges of that these two states pose, and we look forward to pressing the Obama administration on many of the points that you made here today. This hearing is adjourned.